Hello and welcome to this download from Blackwell Online. My name is George Miller, and my guest today is Mark Vernon, a former Church of England priest turned writer on philosophy and belief, whose previous books include Teach Yourself Humanism and The Philosophy of Friendship. Mark's latest book is Plato's Podcasts, subtitled The Ancient's Guide to Modern Living. The subtitle may be clear, but I wanted Mark to tell me more about what the title meant.
The title actually comes from the way that I tried to describe Plato's dialogues, because I think Plato thought that the dialogues which he wrote and which we have that survive weren't really philosophy itself. They were invitations to do philosophy. He thought that philosophy was really done in life, and it's how you live that is a real final test of philosophy. So he wrote these dialogues which represent real characters thinking about things. But the point is, they're not just thinking about things in terms of arguments. They're there with their whole person, their character, their emotions. So in a way, it was Plato's compromise to say, look, philosophy is really done in life, but since I've got to write something, I'll write some dialogues. And I think maybe podcasts today are a bit like that. If you listen to a philosophy podcast, it's not really doing philosophy. The philosophy is done inside your mind and inside your life, but it's an invitation to do philosophy nonetheless.
So it's a way of inviting you and disseminating ideas and stimulating you to think.
Yeah, there's another way of thinking about it is in terms of education, and I think that you only really learn something when you take some risks with it yourself, when you try and discuss it yourself or put it into practice yourself. Just reading something can inform you and it gives you a starter for 10, but in order to really be changed or to inhabit the ideas, you've got to actually kind of take some risks with those ideas yourself.
I got the sense from the book that by returning to the ancients, there was a sort of implicit sense that modern philosophy perhaps has become too introspective, too concerned with its own inner workings, and isn't sort of reaching out in the way that you've just suggested and touching people's real lives.
I think this is a risk in academic philosophy, which a lot of academic philosophers are talking about, actually. And there is a very strong strand in modern philosophy that basically borrows from science and wants to produce proofs and objective knowledge. Obviously, science has been hugely successful in our world, and in some ways it sets the standard for truth. But of course, there are other different kinds of truth, and in particular, the truth that helps people to live, the subjective truth. You know, when you meet someone who is a kind of moral hero, you'd say they were true in some way. They spoke to you of truth. But it's a different kind of truth from subjective truth. And I think that the ancient philosophers were at least as interested in that kind of subjective truth. What changed people? What led to the good life? And you know, we can recover some of that by reading the ancient Greeks again.
Now, you call this collection of philosophers, I think, a ragbag of individuals. And I wondered how you went about choosing which individuals would go in the ragbag.
Well, one of the things I try and do in the book is tell stories about their lives. These stories are gathered by a guy called Diogenes Laertius, who can be trusted sometimes. So partly I wanted to go for good stories. But also, there are some people you have to have in there. And there were at least 6 key schools of philosophy, different kind of characters that set up different approaches to life. So you have to have those 6. But after that, I went to the ones that kind of interested me or that I felt would be relevant to people's lives today.
And did you make discoveries of your own when you were putting the book together?
Yeah, I did. There was one group of philosophers I didn't know that much about called the Cynics. And the Cynics weren't cynical in the way that we think. And they were called Cynics from the Greek for dog. And they lived these kind of prophetic lives. They challenged people around them and upset people and conventions. They were the kind of, the levelers of the ancient Greek world. I hadn't myself read or thought much about them before, but they were a very powerful kind of almost missionary strands within the ancient Greek world, and I was very impressed with them.
You say early on in the book that someone could make the charge that the book is entertaining but anachronistic.
I mean, in some ways the ancient Greek world is very different from our own, but we still read them and they still make sense to us. People still read Plato and Aristotle and they still speak to them, so that suggests that there are commonalities there. When they have some good insights, some good tips, then that stands the test of time too. We kind of test it against our own experience and our own lives. But if it comes from them, then that's for the good. And then the other element, I think, is that we're dealing here really with human nature as much as human technology, which obviously has changed. And I think human nature has roughly remained the same. There's sometimes said that scientific knowledge can be passed down from generation to generation, whereas moral kind of wisdom, we have to learn it afresh in every generation because it has to come from within ourselves. It's part of who we are as persons. And so I think a lot of moral insights are actually pretty timeless.
You mentioned the lives of the philosophers, and it's true, as you say, that you are just as interested in the way they lived their lives as in what they wrote. I mean, in a way, the sort of exemplary quality that you're talking about is not too dissimilar from the lives of Christian saints, who are also held up as sort of examples of how to live, in this case, a decent Christian life.
It's very interesting you mentioned the saints, because another thing I discovered in the research is that a lot of the stories which are told about the ancient Greek philosophers were then told about Christian saints too. So, for example, there's a story about Pyrrho sitting calmly on a boat in the middle of a storm whilst the rest of the passengers were panicking all around him. And of course, a very similar story was told about Jesus on the Sea of Galilee as well. And I think that this is about how the proof of the pudding was in the living and not just in the thinking. These were kind of ancient gurus. I don't think it's going too far really to say that people came to Athens and sat at the feet of Zeno for a while, and then sat at the feet of Epicurus for a while, and kind of tried to work out who was going to speak to them the most. These different schools, they were sometimes in competition, but sometimes it was just a question of no one school could cover the whole of humanity. You need different moments of your life, different insights, different teaching. But there's great stress upon life and living, yeah.
So do you see continuities? You talked about sort of similarities in the narratives of saints and philosophers. Do you actually see continuities rather than sort of caesura between the ancient pagan world and the Christian world of saints?
There is actually a very nice kind of anachronism of history that I think captures that and says exactly that thing, that there is continuity. And that is what happened in the year 529. In the year 529 AD, that was the year that Plato's academy was finally shut in Athens. It'd been open about 900 years, but it finally shut in 529. But in the very same year, Benedict, who is one of the founding fathers of Western monasticism, opened his monastery just outside Rome in Monte Cassino. And in some ways, I think that that's a kind of veritable handing on of the baton, that in the same way that the ancient Greeks tried to come up with sort of rules for living, rules and there's not in the sense of do this and don't do that, but rules as in principles that can carry you through life. That's very much what Benedict was about when he wrote his rule. His rule book is again a book of principles and insights that if you kind of pay attention to will lead to the good life. I mean, it's even the case that some of the ancient Greek philosophers wore the philosopher's cloak, which again looked a bit like the monk's habit. So there is definitely that continuity.